Welcome back to Appropriations 101. Today we have the chairman of the, what we call THUD, Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Subcommittee on the Appropriations Committee, Steve Womack. Good friend of mine. One thing that's interesting about Steve is he was the mayor of Rogers, Arkansas. Town of about 75,000 in Arkansas. And what I've always found out in my political career, the years I've been, whether it was in the state legislature or here, mayors know how to get things done. And that describes Steve probably better than anybody else that I've seen in Congress. He's a good friend of mine, does a great job for our conference, and does a great job for Congress and for the American people. So Steve, the chairman this year, you just started in this term of Housing and Urban Development. You were chairman of Financial Services before that. Tell us a little bit about the the Housing and Urban Development Bill and what are the challenges you face?
Yeah, but before I do that, I want to take this moment, since we've got kind of a captive group here of Simpson people, that one of the things that I have been able to do in the time that I've been in Congress is I've been able to preside over the House of Representatives many times and on some very contentious issues. And they say today that if there's something, if there's some turbulent stuff that's about to happen in the House, you can expect that Womack's going to be in the chair. That's what people say to me today. But I want the people watching this video to know that I was an understudy when I first came here in 2011 to this guy. I learned everything that I know about presiding over the House of Representatives from Mike Simpson. And I consider him to be one of the very best parliamentarian experts out there. But his ability to manage the House chamber was clearly one of the most unique talents that is available in the House of Representatives. So I wanted to say that, Mike, and I've told you that before, and I mean it sincerely. But yeah, so Mike's talking about appropriations, and I think it's important for everybody watching this to know that appropriations is simply the discretionary side of the budget. And we got two different categories. We got mandatory spending, and we got discretionary spending. So we're talking about discretionary spending. It's about a third of government spending, but it's divided up 12 ways. You've got a big piece in defense, and you got a pretty big piece in labor, health, and human services and education, and you got another pretty good sized piece in transportation and housing and urban development. That's what we're talking about today, what we call THUD. It's one of the 12, and there are others. And so my bill is focused on funding the discretionary items associated with all things transportation and all things housing. And so it's roughly, in terms of appropriated dollars, about 90 plus, a little over $90 billion of appropriated money on the discretionary side that I'm responsible for in helping fund the Department of Transportation and the Federal Aviation Administration and so forth. Now there's some additional money on top that we also appropriate that comes from the Highway Trust Fund that's separate, and it's obligated money. And when you add everything up, Mike, in my bill, it's going to come out to roughly a couple $100 billion. But from the appropriation side, it's about 90. And so if you're a Section 8 recipient, that's what we fund. If you're a transportation person in your local community or your county or whatever, then the money that flows from the federal government, that's under our watch. If you get an airport improvement grant at your local airport, then that comes out of my bill. So those are the things that we do.
Yeah, it is. One of the challenges we have, and I've been talking about this for probably the last several years, is that the revenue that comes into the transportation department from the taxes that are generally paid, it's the gas tax, federal, state. States also have registration fees, some property taxes, funds the building of our roads and bridges and that kind of stuff. That amount of money is, with the new cars that are getting 50 miles to the gallon instead of 20 or 15 or something like that, or the EVs, gas tax is going down substantially compared to the cost of what it costs to maintain those roads. Well, how are we gonna fix that in the future? I mean, we gotta
Yeah.
think of a different way to fund roads and bridges in this country.
Sure. Well, as you know, when you go to the pump and you crank out $20 worth of gas, which by the way does not fill your tank up
Yeah.
anymore, the taxes that are associated with that amount of fuel are already baked into the price. So you're $20 is $20, and people are accustomed to that.
Yeah.
Because it's baked in. You mentioned how can we fix this? Then it's going to require more revenue. If the major source of your revenue is going down, gas taxes, because of EVs and other things, you either have to come up with some mechanism or some metric, and there are some out there that will cause electric vehicles to pay their, quote, fair share.
Yeah.
And that could be done on the front end of a purchase. It could be done in other ways as well. But the EV is that electric vehicle is still driving down that road and punishing that road and potentially damaging that road. And if you ever get to EVs on trucks, watch out.
Yeah.
I mean, they create the same disruption and turbulence on the highways that other cars do, but they're not responsible for their share of the maintenance. The other idea, one that I don't particularly care for, and I don't think the American public really likes, is called miles driven.
Yeah.
To where you have to report to Big Brother how many miles you drove this year, and then you pay a bounty for each one of those miles. I think people are comfortable with, they don't want to pay more in taxes, but I think they're comfortable with the way it's done right now because it's baked into the price of the pump. And how do we change that mentality? I am no expert, but we do know this. We got to maintain our roads, and deferring maintenance on roads means it gets more expensive with inflation and other issues. And we have to find a better way, in my opinion, to account for the damage that's being done to our roads and bridges and highways. And it's kind of like the old commercial, you know, you're going to pay me now, or you're going to pay me dearly later.
When I was Speaker of the House in Idaho, we had to raise the gas tax. Hadn't been raised in Idaho for a long time, and it was pretty low. What we found out is that people weren't opposed to increasing the gas tax if they knew the money was going to the roads. Mm-hmm. They didn't want to pay more in taxes to have it go to other projects and that kind of stuff. So we had to say, we created a separate account where all of the new gas tax went into that account, and that account was 100% going on the roads and stuff. And people accepted it pretty well. I don't know anybody that's lost an election because of an increased gas tax. People are willing to pay that. They understand it. They want to drive on good roads and that type of thing. In fact, one of the reasons that I voted actually against the infrastructure bill, it did a lot of the things that I think are necessary that need to be done, but it didn't pay for itself. And down the road, we're gonna hit that brick where we're gonna have to say, okay, what are we gonna do? How are we gonna fund this in the future and stuff? I always thought that's what we should have been doing before we started doing the infrastructure bill. But majority felt otherwise, and so we got the and they're doing great jobs out there.
Well, look, I'm with you on infrastructure, and I voted against that bill too for some of those same reasons, but also because I felt like it was tied to the bigger bill that the Democrats were trying to push. That and you had two sides of the Democrat Party holding each other hostage on it. If you want us to vote for your transportation bill, then you got to vote for this other big spending package.
Right.
And I just felt like that using that as a leverage point was wrong. But that's all water under the bridge. Bottom line is, we move the majority of the American public by cars, by automobiles, and by transit programs, all funded under my bill. And we've got to figure out a way to do this judiciously without, and I think back to your point about people are willing to pay more for something if they know what that something is and that something is going to be protected or sacred. So the separate account, I think, is a good idea. But this is what I found as a mayor and also as a member of Congress. You're right. People, if they believe in the cause, they're willing to pay more for it. They're willing to, I think people would be willing, knowing that we're $35 trillion in debt, I think people would be willing to pay more in taxes temporarily if they knew that 100% of the money that was being collected based on whatever that increase was was gonna go to deficit reduction
Yeah.
and not to commission more spending. A few would disagree with that, but we're in a difficult situation right now. But my biggest concern is that the discretionary spending of the government is what's being held hostage right now,
Yeah.
while the rest of that balance sheet, mandatory spending, is just running off the charts and exponentially higher, particularly in areas of healthcare. And the Congress needs to be able to get its arms around that issue before it becomes too late.
Well, nobody knows that better than Steve. He was chairman of the Budget Committee for a period of time, and it is what we're trying to help the public understand is the discretionary budget that we always get, quit spending, all that kind of stuff, is only about a third of the overall budget. In fact, it's less than that. 2/3 of it is mandatory spending. That's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, 3 big ones, and some other smaller programs. If we don't get control of that, we're never going to be able to balance this budget. In fact, Tom Cole, the chairman of the full committee, told me one time, and I think he's repeated this a number of times, for 10 years, we actually flat funded discretionary spending. Spent less after 10 years than we did before that 10-year period, which I would have thought was amazing to be able to do. But the debt kept going up because mandatory spending kept going up. So we've got to have the courage to talk about mandatory spending and how we're going to address that for the future. Are those programs are not going to be there for our kids and grandkids?
Yeah. The other thing that needs to be said in a piece like this is that discretionary spending, we can have our debates about what's wasteful spending and what's not, but discretionary spending is vitally important. I mean, discretionary spending includes keeping our national parks open.
Yep.
Discretionary spending includes every dime that we're spending to defend this country against all enemies, foreign and domestic, as
Yep.
we say in our oath. Discretionary spending is what funds cancer research and other issues related to National Institutes of Health or the CDC and what have you. That's all discretionary spending. And what Mike just said is absolutely true in that the deficit, the difference between how much we'll bring in and how much will go out, is going to be in round numbers this year about 1.718, nearly $2 trillion. Significant amount of money. The entire discretionary budget of the US government is like 1.6.
Yeah.
So you have to get into the mandatory programs and either restructure or infuse them with more revenue or cut programs if you're going to save this country from certain fiscal calamity.
Yeah.
And we just don't have the courage to do that.
Yeah. Let me ask you just one other. This is transportation and housing and urban development, as we talked about. What are the challenges in the housing area at this bill?
First of all, we have a lot of need. And I don't need to tell you that across the country, not just in Northwest Arkansas, but in Idaho and California and elsewhere, we have a housing shortage. And more specifically, Mike, we have an affordable housing shortage. And people just can't afford that big piece of the American dream. And so because of the housing shortage and because income hasn't kept up with the inflationary cost of everyday spending, people just can't afford to live in a place. They're going to rent. Yeah. And now rents are so high, rents are even higher than some mortgage payments in many cases because of the shortage. It's supply and demand 101. But that's one of the challenges we have is we have more demand. So in my bill this year, because we are keeping it at the limits that we enacted into Congress a couple of years ago, we can't exceed those limits, and I'm not exceeding those limits. But what I said to our team was that we don't want to fund housing programs at a level that's going to cause vulnerable people to be out of the program. Yeah. So if they're low income, or if they're veterans, or if they're disabled, these are the vulnerable populations of our country. I want to protect them. And we do in this bill. We make sure that this bill is not going to result in a whole bunch of people being forced out onto the sidewalk. And on the FAA side of the house, may I just say that we have an air traffic control shortage, you know that, and it's causing some problems. And so we put more money into personnel to feed that pipeline, to help our airports and for the modernization of our airports and the expansion of our airports. Air travel is growing exponentially. And so therefore, those were the commitments that I made. Those were the two general areas that I said I wanted to make sure that we did in this bill, despite the fact that we were playing underneath the caps that we had agreed to. And I got one other thing I want to say. We have a new program. I'm not a big fan of, quote, new government programs.
Yeah.
You know, Reagan said there's nothing more like eternal life than a government program. But I put $200 million into this particular bill for truck parking across the country. Anywhere at night, when it gets dark, just drive down an interstate highway, and what do you see on the exit ramps? And what do you see at the state parks? You see trucks parked for the night because they got hours of service limitations, and they gotta park their trucks, and they have nowhere to go. And so there's not a Walmart big parking lot everywhere up and down those interstates, so these trucks have to find a place to go. We put a pilot program in there so DOT could begin to put some money into some truck parking programs that would be beneficial to the trucking community, because still most everything that we consume every day is moved by 18-wheelers. So that's one program that we're kind of excited about this year, and we'll see how it shakes out when we get ready to go to conference.
That's interesting. Let me just conclude by telling you this story that during the pandemic, I had to drive home because my doctor wouldn't let me get on an airplane. So I drove home. And while I knew it intellectually, it's the first time I ever really saw it. There were not, passenger cars on the interstate and everything, but there were trucks. And I tell you what, those truckers kept us alive during the pandemic.
You sure did.
And every time I said, okay, there's a rest area coming up, I'm gonna pull over and take a nap for a little, I couldn't get in the rest area. There were so many trucks there. In fact, I got stuck in Sydney, Nebraska in a snowstorm. This was at the end of March, in a Walmart parking lot with about 50 semis parked in that parking lot and me waiting for the snow to go away so we could get back on the road. But trucks are vitally important to this country. Everything you consume at some point in time was on a truck.
Everything. And we're gonna do this pilot program in hopes that it takes off and solves at least one part of our transportation challenge. Before we go, I just want to say this: how lucky you folks are to be represented by one of the most respected members in the House of Representatives. Mike's been there a while. He's a dear friend of mine. As I told you early on, I studied him as he presided over the House, and he's an effective appropriator, and he's a great advocate for Idaho. So. Thank you so much for sending Mike to Washington to be my colleague.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate it.
You bet.